See this base? Do you know what it is? It's a Chinese military base, but it's not in China. It's deep in the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan, just 10 kilometers from the Afghan border. It houses 500 personnel, has its own helipad, and represents something unprecedented: China's first security facility outside its own territory. This isn't just another outpost. It's a signal of how dramatically China's security strategy is evolving. And recent deadly attacks on Chinese workers in the region are forcing Beijing to make decisions that could reshape Central Asian geopolitics for decades to come. Today, we're diving into China's growing security presence in Tajikistan, why violence along the Afghan border is escalating, and what this means for the future of Central Asia. This is a story about strategic vulnerability, rising tensions, and the limits of Chinese power projection. Let's get into it, but before we dive in, if you're new here and want more deep dive analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you. Before we talk about China's secret base, we need to understand what's been happening on the ground in Tajikistan, because it's these recent events that are forcing China's hand. Let me paint you a picture of southern Tajikistan in late 2025 and early 2026. In November 2025, armed militants using drones launched an attack on a Chinese gold mining operation in the Shamsuddin Sahin district of southern Tajikistan. The same area had seen an attack just a month earlier, but this was different. 3 Chinese nationals were killed. The attack was apparently linked to a dispute over mining activities affecting local water sources, specifically a river that the communities depended on. Now here's where it gets interesting. According to 8 AM Media, an independent Afghan outlet, the Chinese company didn't scale back operations after this attack. Instead, they actually increased their activities, having received security guarantees from the Tajik government. Think about that for a moment. Deadly attack happens, and the response is to double down with promises of protection. The situation was spiraling. The Tajik and Afghan sides attempted to de-escalate. The day after the first major attack, a Taliban delegation even visited the leadership of Tajikistan's Gorno-Badakhshan region, known as Kabul, where most of the border is located. But these talks broke down completely. 4 days after the meeting, 2 more Chinese workers were killed. This time, they were from the China Road and Bridge Corporation, working near a village of Shodak in Darvaz district. Then, on January 6, 2026, just after midnight, Tajik security forces killed 4 armed militants who had crossed from Afghanistan into southern Tajikistan.
برای تامین امنیت سرحدی دولتی من بعد نیست از تمام قوای واسطه استفاده نموده به سرحدچیکنان جوابی سزاوار قانونی خواهد داد.
These militants, labeled as members of an unspecified terrorist organization, refused to surrender after a firefight near the strategic Pamir Highway, the very road that connects Tajikistan to China. The consequences were immediate. Construction of the Dushanbe China International Highway in Darvaz district was suspended to ensure worker safety. While construction resumed in late January, the damage was done. Chinese investment projects in the region now operate under the constant threat of violence. These aren't just isolated incidents. They represent a fundamental change to China's entire strategy in Central Asia. So why does China care so much about Tajikistan? Why build a secret facility in one of the most remote regions on Earth?
Meetings between Chinese officials in 2014 where Xi Jinping expressed a lot of concern. At that time, of course, ISIS had emerged in Syria, and there was a great degree of concern that Uyghurs based in Syria would come to Afghanistan and then cross the border through Tajikistan into Xinjiang.
At the heart of Chinese security concerns is Xinjiang, officially called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. This is China's westernmost province, home to the Uyghur people and the site of what international observers have documented as mass detention, surveillance, and cultural suppression.
The Uyghurs have much more in common with the peoples of Central Asia than they do with the Han Chinese people. Culturally, historically, linguistically, they share a lot of commonalities with the people of former Soviet Central Asia, the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, and so on. In fact, many of those people also inhabit the Uyghur region of China.
Since the early 1990s, Chinese officials have consistently framed neighboring Central Asia, and Tajikistan in particular, as a security buffer zone. The goal is to insulate Xinjiang from what Beijing calls the three evils: separatism, extremism, and terrorism. Since 2017, Chinese authorities have detained an estimated 1 million or more Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang in extrajudicial internment facilities. They've imposed extensive surveillance and movement restrictions and pursued policies that the United States and several other governments have characterized as genocide and crimes against humanity. This matters for understanding the security situation in Tajikistan. Groups like the Islamic State of Khorasan province have sought to exploit Beijing's treatment of Uyghurs as a mobilizing grievance.
That they see China as an adversary, and that the Taliban has been cooperating with China, they see as a huge problem, because China is this anti-Islamic, they will say, like, anti-Islamic, ideologically very opposed to Islam, and so what the right thing to do would be to fight them from ISIS's perspective.
Let me be clear about what this means in practice. China views Tajikistan as a potential corridor through which instability could flow into Xinjiang. The country shares a 270-mile border with China's most sensitive region, and beyond Tajikistan lies Afghanistan, which has long been a source of security anxiety for Beijing. That fear isn't entirely theoretical. The Islamic State of Khorasan province, ISKP, has demonstrated a growing capacity to target Chinese interests in Afghanistan.
So they've been also heavily involved in planning ISIS attacks outside of Afghanistan. So we saw in 2024 the attack in Moscow. We saw also in 2022 they claimed rocket attacks on Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. So we've seen that it's been very involved also in kind of these outside.
The group has cultivated tactical relationships with Uyghur militant organizations, most notably the Turkestan Islamic Party, to execute attacks against Chinese nationals. On January 19th, ISKP claimed responsibility for an assault on a Chinese restaurant in Kabul that killed at least 7 people. The attack was followed by a coordinated media campaign across ISKP-aligned channels, disseminated in 8 languages, explicitly threatening further strikes against Chinese interests. 8 languages. That's not a random act of terrorism. That's a sophisticated organization signaling both its intent to sustain pressure on Beijing and its capacity to project messaging across multiple regions. That is why Tajikistan is so important to China. Dushanbe is essentially part of Beijing's firewall against Central Asian instability.
The primary goal is to protect China, right? It's concerned that there may be spillovers, particularly from Afghanistan across the Tajik border into China, and that may cause a destabilization, right? We've seen evidence of this, through, the readouts of meetings between Central Asian officials in China, these leaked speeches by Xi Jinping. So they are genuinely concerned, and that's driven their increased security presence in the region over the past decade.
But there's another dimension to this: China's Belt and Road Initiative. Tajikistan sits along key transportation corridors that China is developing to connect itself to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The Pamir Highway, where the January firefight occurred, isn't just any road, it's a strategic artery for Chinese economic and security interests. This is where economic and security interests converge for China. You can't secure your investments without securing the territory. You can't secure the territory without deeper military and security involvement. And deeper involvement means greater risk and exposure. China is walking a tightrope, and recent attacks are making that tightrope increasingly unstable.
I think there's evidence that China's footprint is potentially expanding. Talk of additional bases in the Pamir region, up near the Gab. Chinese personnel won't be stationed there, but they're investing in another facility, a strategic facility on the border in the Wakhan corridor between Tajikistan and Afghanistan for Tajikistan's Ministry of Internal Affairs. So, I don't think China's going anywhere in terms of its presence. Tajikistan in particular in the Pamir region.
Now let's talk about that facility I mentioned at the beginning. In 2016, China's Ministry of Public Security established a surveillance facility in Tajikistan's Pamir region. Located just 10 miles from the Afghan border, this facility was designed to house up to 500 personnel and includes a helipad for rapid deployment. This was a watershed moment. It marked China's first security facility in Central Asia and its first military or security installation outside Chinese territory. Let that sink in for a moment. For a country that has historically avoided foreign military bases and criticized other powers for maintaining them, this represented a significant shift in Chinese security policy. And it wasn't a one-off. This facility foreshadowed the expansion of other Chinese military installations, a naval base in Djibouti, facilities in Cuba, and installations in Argentina. But the base is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to China's security presence in Tajikistan. Since 2018, China has provided significant military equipment to Tajikistan, including mine-resistant vehicles, tactical armored vehicles, assault rifles, and self-propelled mortars. China has also built or renovated at least 15 security facilities across the country over the past decade. In 2021, Tajikistan's Ministry of Internal Affairs invited China to fund a new paramilitary facility in the Wuhan corridor, directly on the border with Afghanistan. This would represent an even more forward-deployed Chinese security presence. But it's not just hardware and facilities. China's been building institutional ties and operational capacity.
通过与塔方军人的交流，我发现塔方在边防巡逻管控上有许多值得我们学习的地方。我会取长补短，刻苦训练，守卫好祖国西大门。
Joint military exercises have become routine. Between 2002 and 2023, Tajikistan participated in 19 of 36 joint military exercises China conducted with Central Asian militaries. Most of these were conducted through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but 6 were organized bilaterally. In 2023, China and Tajikistan security ministries pledged to organize joint anti-terrorist exercises at least once every 2 years. Just before the November 2025 border clashes, both sides agreed to carry out bilateral joint patrols, prevent the infiltration and spread of terrorist forces, and build a strong security shield for the development of both nations. There's also a growing role for private security. Chinese legislation allows Chinese security firms to operate in Tajikistan under the supervision of local law enforcement. Companies like Three Lions International have formed partnerships with Tajik security firms. In 2022, Chinese security contractors trained with Tajik police in exercises simulating the defense of a Chinese mine. This private security dimension is crucial because it gives Beijing flexibility and plausible deniability. If something goes wrong, the Chinese government can maintain some distance from the actions of private contractors.
Приветствую вас на торжественной церемонии передачи комплекта продукции военного назначения Министерству обороны Республики Таджикистан.
Now, I want to emphasize something important here. Russia remains the dominant security provider in Tajikistan. Russia provides almost all of the Tajik military's hardware and stations over 6,000 troops in the country. China's role, while growing, is still secondary. But their trajectory is clear. China is steadily expanding its security footprint in ways that would have been unthinkable 2 decades ago. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Because despite the growing security presence, China faces significant constraints on how far it can go. Let's start with the elephant in the room, xenophobia. While Tajik elites enthusiastically embrace Chinese investment because they benefit directly from lucrative contracts and security assistance that keeps them in power, the general population is far more wary.
You know, people in Central Asia have been pushing back against China, criticizing it for damaging the environment, concerns around sovereignty, around encroachment by China into the region.
In 2022, Bradley Jardine and Edward Lemon conducted fieldwork in Tajikistan for their book Backlash: China's Struggle for Influence in Central Asia.
So Backlash explores China's rise in Central Asia, its rise economically, its rise politically, its rise in security terms.
What they found was eye-opening. In Hojan, Tajikistan's second largest city, a local told them, "They come here, build roads, but what do you think they're for? They're built to support the tanks of the Chinese army."
China being a very large neighbor, there's concerns that China is infiltrating societies, that it's trying to colonize the region. There's concerns over supply of water, and many of the rivers that cross the border between China and the Central Asian countries. China controls flow of those rivers. Concerns over ecological damage, concerns about China hiring their own workers rather than local workers. And so, there's this whole host of concerns that seem to be kind of particularly prominent when Central Asians are responding to China's presence in the region. There's a great degree of concern.
Near China's strategic facility in the Pamirs, people expressed fears about the annexation of Tajik land. These aren't fringe conspiracy theories. They represent genuine popular anxiety about Chinese intentions, and this creates a real political problem for both China and the Tajik government. There's a fundamental tension here. The more visible China's security presence becomes, the more it risks popular backlash. The more Chinese workers are attacked, the more security presence China needs. It's a vicious cycle. This brings us to a crucial point about China's strategic approach. Despite the recent attacks, and despite the growing security challenges, China is unlikely to dramatically deepen its military involvement in Central Asia. Why? First, because doing so would expose Beijing to what analysts call strategic entrapment. China would become entangled in local grievances, succession politics, and elite rivalries that are inherently volatile and costly to manage. These are internal Central Asian dynamics that China has little ability to control.
Xi Jinping.
Second, a more assertive security role would generate political backlash not just in Tajikistan, but across Central Asia and potentially damage China's broader diplomatic relationships in the region. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it would contradict China's carefully cultivated image as a different kind of great power, one that doesn't interfere in other countries' internal affairs and doesn't maintain a network of foreign military bases like the United States. So what's China likely to do instead? Beijing will likely imitate strategies it has used along its other borders, particularly in East Asia. Let me give you 3 examples. In Bhutan, China has pursued what scholars call friendly annexation. This involves incremental territorial advances paired with infrastructure construction and diplomatic engagement. The key is calibrated restraint to avoid provoking international backlash while steadily strengthening China's presence. Along the Myanmar border, China has combined conflict mediation with selective tolerance of instability. It leverages ethnic Chinese armed groups and economic dependencies to maintain influence without assuming formal security responsibility. On the border with Vietnam, China has relied on militarized deterrence combined with crisis management. It uses force episodically, but quickly channels disputes through party-to-party and diplomatic channels to prevent escalation. The common thread across all these cases is Beijing's preference for managing risk below the threshold of open conflict while preserving strategic flexibility and steadily advancing its security interests. In other words, China wants influence without responsibility. It wants security without occupation. It wants stability without direct intervention. This is an incredibly difficult balance to maintain, especially when your workers are being killed. So where does this all lead? The situation in Tajikistan represents a microcosm of broader challenges China faces as it expands its global footprint. The Belt and Road Initiative sounds great in theory. Build infrastructure, create economic connectivity, expand Chinese influence. But infrastructure needs protection. Workers need security, and security commitments have a way of spiraling beyond what they originally were intended to be. China is discovering what other great powers have learned. You can't have economic empire without security commitments, and security commitments tend to grow. What we're seeing in Tajikistan is China being forced to make hard choices about how far it's willing to go to protect its investments and its nationals abroad. The secret base in the Pamirs was supposed to be enough. The joint patrols and military assistance were supposed to create a security buffer. But hostile actors don't always respect those buffers. And when your nationals get killed, domestic pressure builds for stronger action. The recent violence has already disrupted investment projects. Construction delays mean economic losses. Economic losses mean pressure from Chinese companies for better security guarantees. Better security guarantees mean deeper military involvement, and deeper involvement means more risk of backlash and entrapment. It's a security dilemma with no easy answers. Whether violence against Chinese workers continues or escalates, and how Beijing responds. Each attack creates pressure for a stronger response. But each stronger response risks strategic overextension.
China's been more reluctant in that regard, so I don't expect there to be like a massive increase in China's presence. China's going to continue to work through providing more assistance, for example, to the Tajik security services who control that border, more funding, more training, more joint exercises, joint border patrols. It's going to actually deploy more private security companies to protect its assets in the region.
The facility in the Pamirs, 10 miles from the Afghan border, represents China's attempt to square this circle, to provide security without appearing too threatening, to protect its interests without overextending itself, to build influence without triggering backlash. Recent attacks on Chinese workers show how fragile this balance is. Violence has a way of forcing hard choices, and the choices China makes in Tajikistan will shape its approach to security challenges across the Belt and Road. This is a story that's far from over. As China's economic interests expand globally, we're likely to see more facilities like the one in Tajikistan, more security partnerships, more private contractors, and more difficult strategic dilemmas. The question isn't whether China will become more involved in providing security for its overseas interests. The question is how much involvement it can sustain without undermining its broader strategic goals. Thanks for watching. This video is based on an analysis by Edward Lemon, Bradley Jardine, and Oleg Antonov for the Turan Research Center. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read the full piece. If you found this video informative, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. And let me know in the comments, do you think China will eventually challenge Russia's security dominance in Central Asia? Or will Beijing continue its patient, low visibility approach?